Hello, ladies and gentlemen. When you feel down, when everything seems heavy and unbearable, you have to start by telling yourself the truth. Life is hard. It's not fair. It will break you if you let it. And when you're in that place, when you're exhausted, overwhelmed, uncertain, you'll be tempted to believe that there's no way forward, that it's all too much, that maybe you should just give up, stop trying, retreat into the shadows, and let the world move on without you. But that's not the answer. That's never the answer. Because the only thing worse than suffering is meaningless suffering. And if you're going to suffer, you might as well make something of it. You might as well turn that pain into something worthwhile, something that justifies the struggle. The first thing you have to do is recognize that you don't get to escape difficulty. No one does. No one gets through life without being tested, without being wounded, without being forced to their knees at some point. But you do get to decide what you do in response. You get to decide whether you'll stay there broken and bitter or whether you'll stand up and start moving forward, even if it's only one small step at a time. And that's the key. You don't have to fix everything all at once. In fact, you can't. If you're down, really down, you don't have the strength for that, but you do have the strength for something. Maybe it's as simple as getting out of bed a reasonable hour. Maybe it's cleaning up the mess in your room or going outside for 5 minutes. Maybe it's reaching out to one person who cares about you. Whatever it is, do it. Start there. Because even the smallest victory, the tiniest bit of order, is proof that you're capable of moving forward. People make the mistake of thinking that if they don't feel like doing something, it doesn't matter whether they do it or not. But that's wrong. That's a dangerous way to think. Your feelings are unreliable, especially when you're down. They'll lie to you. They'll tell you that nothing matters, that you're hopeless, that there's no way out. But action comes first. You act despite how you feel, and the feelings follow. That's how you climb out of despair. Not by waiting to feel better, but by proving to yourself that you have what it takes to move forward, even when you don't want to. And as you move, as you take on a little more responsibility, as you start to impose order on the chaos in your life, you'll begin to see something incredible. The weight doesn't disappear, but you get stronger. The problems don't vanish, but you become more capable of facing them. And one day you'll look back at the version of yourself who thought they couldn't go on, and you'll realize that you made it through. The darkness isn't permanent. It never is. But you have to act like that's true before you'll ever see it for yourself. So take the next step, no matter how small, no matter how difficult. Move forward. Because that's how you win. Face the truth of suffering. Life is not easy. It never has been, and it never will be. The first mistake people make when they find themselves in a dark place is believing that suffering is something abnormal, something that isn't supposed to happen. They look around and think that other people have it easier, that the struggle they're facing is unfair, that they've been uniquely burdened in a way no one else has. But that isn't true. Suffering is built into the structure of existence itself. It is not an accident, and it is not something that only happens to the unfortunate. It is the default state of life. The moment you are born, you are vulnerable, you are weak, dependent, and fragile. And from that moment forward, you are in a battle against entropy, against decay, against the forces that seek to pull everything apart. Everything in life, including you, moves naturally toward disorder, toward chaos, toward suffering. Your body ages, your loved ones pass away, relationships fracture, careers fall apart, unexpected tragedies strike without warning. That's reality. The problem isn't that suffering exists. The problem is how people respond to it. Many people try to avoid it, to pretend it's not there. They numb themselves with distractions, addictions, and meaningless pleasures, hoping that if they ignore the pain long enough, it will go away. But it doesn't. In fact, it only gets worse, because suffering that is ignored doesn't dissolve, it festers. And when it festers, it turns into something far more destructive: resentment, bitterness, nihilism. The truth, however, is that suffering isn't just an obstacle, it's an invitation. An invitation to grow, to develop resilience, to build something meaningful in the face of difficulty. The people who do well in life, the ones who develop wisdom and strength, are not the ones who avoid suffering. They are the ones who confront it directly. They acknowledge its existence, they accept its presence, and then they take responsibility for dealing with it. Taking responsibility doesn't mean blaming yourself for everything that goes wrong. It doesn't mean wallowing in guilt or self-pity. It means looking at your life honestly and asking, what can I do about this? Because even when life deals you an unfair hand, you are never powerless. There is always something, some small action, some change in perspective, some step forward that you can take. And that step, however small, is the beginning of something greater. This is why avoiding the truth of suffering is so dangerous. When you refuse to face it, you place yourself in a position of helplessness. You become a victim not just of circumstance, but of your own mindset. You begin to believe that life is something that happens to you, rather than something you can actively shape. And once you believe that, you surrender your ability to improve your situation. But when you face suffering directly, when you look it in the eye and say, yes, this is painful, but I will not be destroyed by it, you transform. You begin to build strength where there was once weakness. You cultivate resilience where there was once fragility. And in doing so, you create meaning out of hardship. This doesn't mean the pain disappears. It doesn't mean life suddenly becomes easy. But it does mean that you are no longer at its mercy. You are no longer waiting for things to get better before you decide to start living. You are moving forward despite the difficulty, despite the fear, despite the setbacks. And in the end, that's the only way through. Because suffering is inevitable, but being broken by it is not. The choice is yours. Start small, but start now. When you're overwhelmed, when life feels unbearably heavy, the instinct's often to do nothing, to freeze, to wait. You tell yourself that you'll start when you feel better, when circumstances improve, when the right moment arrives. But that moment never comes, and the longer you wait, the worse things get. This is the trap people fall into, the belief that if they can't solve everything at once, there's no point in trying at all. It's an all or nothing mindset, and it's dangerous because it paralyzes you. If your life is in disorder, if you're struggling, if you feel lost, it's unlikely that you have the energy or clarity to fix everything overnight. And if you expect yourself to, you're setting yourself up for failure. But here's the truth: progress isn't about massive leaps, it's about small, consistent actions. It's about taking the tiniest step in the right direction, no matter how insignificant it seems, because the smallest action is always better than inaction. If you're drowning, even lifting your head above the water for a second is a step toward survival. So where do you start? You start with what's right in front of you. Maybe you can't fix your whole life today, but you can clean your room. You can organize your desk. You can get out of bed at a reasonable hour. And while these actions might seem trivial, they aren't. They're proof. Proof that you are capable of imposing order, even in a small way. Proof that you are not entirely at the mercy of chaos. Proof that you have the ability to move forward, even if only by an inch. And that proof matters. Because when you're stuck in a rut, when you feel lost, what you need more than anything is evidence that change is possible. The way you gather that evidence is by doing anything that improves your situation, no matter how small. People often underestimate how powerful small improvements can be. They think, what difference does it make if I make my bed? My problems are so much bigger than that. But it makes a difference because it changes the way you see yourself. If you begin the day by doing something productive, however minor, you start to build momentum. And momentum is everything. Once you accomplish one small task, you're in a better position to accomplish another. Maybe you clean your room and then you decide to go for a short walk. Maybe that walk clears your mind enough to write down some goals. Maybe writing down those goals makes you realize that there's a phone call you've been avoiding that you can finally make. And before you know it, you've moved further in a day than you have in months, all because you started with something small. This isn't about pretending that small tasks will fix everything. They won't. But they will get you moving. And once you're moving, you can start to take on bigger responsibilities. You can begin to tackle the real problems in your life, the ones that feel impossible when you're stuck in a state of inaction. The key is to start now. Not tomorrow, not next week, not when you feel ready. Because if you wait until you feel ready, you'll be waiting forever. Readiness isn't a requirement for action. Action creates readiness. You don't wait to feel motivated before you start working out. You start working out, and then the motivation follows. You don't wait to feel confident before you take responsibility. You take responsibility, and the confidence builds from there. So start small. Clean one thing. Do one task. Take one step, and do it now. Because the sooner you start, the sooner you'll realize that you are not as powerless as you thought. And once you realize that, everything changes. Act before you feel like it. One of the biggest mistakes people make when they're struggling is believing that they need to feel ready before they take action. They tell themselves they'll start when they feel motivated, when they're in a better mood, when things feel easier. But that's a dangerous illusion because feelings are unreliable. If you wait until you feel like doing something difficult, you might never do it at all. Think about the days when you don't want to get out of bed, when you feel exhausted, unmotivated, and hopeless. If you let those feelings dictate your actions, what happens? You stay in bed, you avoid responsibilities, you put things off. And what's the result? You feel even worse. You reinforce the belief that you're incapable of doing hard things. You allow inaction to become a habit. But here's the truth. Action isn't something that follows motivation, it creates it. The way out of paralysis isn't to wait until you feel inspired. It's to move despite the fact that you don't want to. That's the only way forward. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that your emotions should be in charge. That if you don't feel like working out, you shouldn't. That if you don't feel like cleaning up, it's okay to let the mess sit for another day. But if you live that way, you become a slave to your emotions, and your emotions are not always on your side. In fact, when you're feeling down, your emotions will actively work against you. They will tell you that nothing matters, that there's no point, that you're too tired, too broken, too far gone. If you listen to those emotions, you reinforce them. But if you act against them, you weaken them. If you get out of bed when you don't feel like it, you prove to yourself that you have control. If you go to the gym when you don't feel like it, you build discipline. If you start working on a project when you don't feel like it, you gain momentum. And what happens after that? Your feelings catch up to your actions. You start to feel better because you acted not the other way around. This is how confidence is built. People think confidence comes from feeling good about yourself first and then taking action. But it's the opposite. Confidence comes from doing hard things, from proving to yourself that you can handle discomfort. Every time you act, despite not wanting to, you strengthen that part of yourself that is disciplined, reliable, and capable. Now, this doesn't mean you ignore your emotions entirely. It's not about suppressing how you feel or pretending that pain and exhaustion don't exist. It's about refusing to let those emotions dictate your choices. You can acknowledge that you feel unmotivated and still take action. You can recognize that you're tired and still move forward. The key is to start with something small. If you don't feel like getting up, tell yourself you'll just put your feet on the floor. If you don't feel like writing, commit to just one sentence. If you don't feel like exercising, promise yourself 5 minutes of movement. The moment you take that first step, the resistance starts to weaken. And here's the most important part: the more you act despite how you feel, the stronger you become. You stop being a person who only does things when they're easy. You become someone who does what needs to be done, no matter what. And that's a powerful transformation. Because when you master this, when you learn to act before you feel like it, you gain control over your life in a way most people never will. Take on responsibility to find meaning. Life is difficult. Suffering is inevitable. And when you find yourself in pain, whether from loss, failure, uncertainty, or regret, you might ask yourself, what's the point of all this? That's a dangerous question, because if you don't have an answer, you risk falling into despair. And despair is a terrible place to be. It's where people give up, where they stop trying, where they surrender to nihilism and believe that nothing matters. But there is an answer. And it's not happiness or pleasure or fleeting success. It's responsibility, because meaning is not something you find by chasing what's easy or comfortable. It's something you create by taking on the weight of existence, by voluntarily carrying as much responsibility as you can bear. Most people don't want to hear this. They want life to be easier. They want to avoid burden, not embrace it. But what they fail to realize is that responsibility is the path to meaning. It's what gives life structure and purpose. Without it, you're lost. Think about what happens when people reject responsibility. They drift, they become passive. They spend their time on meaningless distractions, numbing themselves with entertainment, addictions, and mindless pleasure. And at first, it might feel good. There's a certain freedom in avoiding responsibility. But eventually, it leads to emptiness, because deep down you know you were meant for more than this. You know you're avoiding something important, and that knowledge eats away at you. The alternative is to take on responsibility voluntarily, to stop waiting for life to become easier and instead ask yourself, what can I do to make things better? That question is powerful because it shifts your focus. It moves you from victimhood to agency. It forces you to look at what's within your control instead of what's outside of it. Start where you are. If your life is in chaos, if you feel lost, if you don't know where to begin with the smallest thing you can take responsibility for. Clean your room, fix your schedule, show up on time. These things seem trivial, but they're not. They're the foundation. Because if you can't take responsibility for yourself, how can you take responsibility for anything greater? And once you've done that, move outward. Take responsibility for your relationships. Be the person others can rely on. Show up for your friends. Support your family. Be honest, be disciplined, be strong, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. Then, expand even further. Take responsibility for something outside of yourself. Maybe it's your community, maybe it's your workplace, maybe it's something bigger, an idea, a cause, a mission. The point is to carry something beyond your own self-interest, because the more responsibility you take on, the more meaningful your life becomes. And here's what happens when you do this. Suffering doesn't disappear, but it becomes bearable. Why? Because when you take on responsibility, you give your suffering context. You're no longer suffering for nothing. You're suffering for a reason, because you're building something, because you're helping others, because you're striving towards something worthwhile. And that changes everything. When you have meaning, you can endure almost anything. You can face hardship with resilience. You can wake up in the morning with purpose, even when things are difficult. You can carry the burdens of life without collapsing under them. So if you're struggling, if you feel lost, don't ask, how can I make things easier? Ask, what responsibility can I take on? Because that's where meaning begins, and meaning is what makes life worth living. Progress makes you stronger. Life is difficult, and no one is exempt from struggle. But the way you respond to that struggle determines whether it breaks you or makes you stronger. Many people believe that the key to happiness is to avoid hardship, to seek comfort, to minimize pain. But this is wrong. The key to a meaningful and resilient life isn't avoiding difficulty, it's facing it head on and proving to yourself that you can overcome it. The truth is, you don't get stronger by staying where you are. You get stronger by moving forward, by making progress, even when it's painful, even when it's slow. And the most important thing to understand is this: progress is what builds you. It's what transforms you from someone who is overwhelmed by life into someone who can handle it. When you're stuck in a bad place, whether it's depression, failure, loss, or uncertainty, it feels like you'll never escape. The weight of it is crushing, and you don't see a way forward. That's when you start believing the lie there's no point in trying, that nothing will ever change, that you're doomed to stay exactly where you are. But that's not true. It's never true. Because no matter how bad things are, you can always take some kind of step forward. Maybe it's a small step, so small it feels insignificant. But it's not insignificant, because the moment you move forward, even a little, something shifts inside you. You start to remember that you are not entirely helpless, that you are not a prisoner of your circumstances, that you still have agency. And here's what happens when you start moving. Progress builds momentum. When you accomplish one small thing, whether it's getting out of bed on time, cleaning your space, making a difficult phone call, you gain confidence. You begin to see yourself as someone who can act rather than someone who is stuck. And that change in perception is everything. Because the more progress you make, the stronger you become. Think of it like lifting weights. The first time you try, the weight feels unbearable. You can barely lift it. But if you keep showing up, if you keep pushing through the discomfort, something amazing happens. You get stronger. What was once impossible becomes easy, and then you move on to something heavier, and you get stronger again. Life works the same way. If you face your problems, if you tackle challenges instead of running from them, you build strength. At first, it's hard, so hard that you might feel like giving up. But every time you push forward, every time you endure, every time you keep going despite the pain, you change. You become someone who can handle difficulty, someone who doesn't crumble under pressure, someone who isn't afraid to take on responsibility, to pursue meaningful goals, to carry burdens that would have crushed the person you used to be. This is why progress, even in the smallest form, is so important. It doesn't just change your situation, it changes you. And that's the real goal. Because life doesn't get easier. The challenges don't disappear. But if you get stronger, you can handle them. You can take on more. You can build a life that is meaningful rather than one that is dictated by fear, hesitation, and avoidance. So if you're struggling, if you feel weak, don't focus on how far you have to go. Focus on one step forward, just one. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be impressive. It just has to be something. Because if you take that step today, and another tomorrow, and another after that, you'll look back and realize that you are no longer the same person who once felt trapped. Progress makes you stronger. And when you are stronger, you don't have to fear life. You can take it on with everything you've got. So what does this all mean? It means that where you are now is not where you have to stay. It means that no matter how weak, lost, or overwhelmed you feel, there is a way forward, but only if you take it. It won't come to you. It won't happen by accident. It happens when you take responsibility, when you act before you feel ready, when you push forward despite resistance. And in doing so, you become something more than you are today. The path is difficult. Of course it is, but what's the alternative? To stay stuck, to let fear and hesitation dictate your life, to allow the weight of suffering to crush you. That's not a path at all. It's a slow descent into bitterness and regret. And you don't want that. You know you don't want that. So take a step. A small one if necessary, but take it now. And then take another tomorrow. And another the day after that, because progress is not just about changing your circumstances, it's about transforming yourself into someone who can handle life. Someone who can bear the weight of existence with strength, purpose, and resilience. And if you can do that, if you can commit to the process of becoming stronger, of carrying your burdens voluntarily, of making things just a little bit better, then you have already won. Because you are no longer running, you are no longer waiting, you are moving forward. And there is no greater proof that you are alive than that.